The Transportation Policy Coordinating Committee to order. First item is roll call and an opportunity for audience members to introduce themselves. I'll start. I'm Jordan Hess, City Council.
Dave Strohmeyer, Missoula County.
Jane Curtis, Missoula County.
Corey Aldridge, proxy for Don MacArthur, Missoula Urban Transportation District.
Jessica Morris, MPO.
Aaron Wilson, MPO. Craig McLeod, Department of Transportation.
Kevin Davis, Missoula Citizen. Russ Fletcher, Montana Technology Limited.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We have minutes from April 17th. I'd entertain a motion to approve those or amend them and approve them as amended.
I'd move that we approve the minutes.
Okay, that motion is in order. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any public comment on the minutes? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? Okay, those are approved. Is there public comment on items not on our agenda? Okay, we have 3 items of new business. The first is to review and approve a memorandum of agreement for cooperative performance-based planning, safety performance measures and targets. And Jessica, are you going to introduce this?
Yes,
Followed by
and
Craig?
then I'm
Okay.
going to pass it off pretty quickly. But so if you recall, several months ago, we brought forward safety performance measures, which are new requirements under the FAST Act. And the FAST Act includes additional performance measures for other things such as pavement condition, bridge condition, travel time reliability. And so we also, as the MPO, have to adopt performance measures for those. And similarly to what we did with the safety performance measures, where we said that we would support the state's targets that they set as the MPO and work towards helping them achieve those targets, we're recommending the same for the remainder of the performance measures. And so Craig McLeod from MDT has graciously agreed to join us today, give you guys a short presentation about the remainder of those performance measures and answer any questions that you may have. He was here for the TTAC meeting a couple weeks ago, and the TTAC made the motion for TPCC to approve the performance measures and targets as set out by the state. So I'm going to hand it over to Craig.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Craig McLeod with the Montana Department of Transportation. I've got about 15 minutes worth of presentation here to go over that talks a little bit about how the state set performance targets required by Title 23 of Section 150 in MAP 21, and then further clarified in FHWA rulemaking. Jessica mentioned that the state and the MPO have set safety targets already. This afternoon, I'll be talking about the process that MDT went through to establish targets for the PM2 measures, which are pavement condition and bridge condition, and the PM3 measures, which are the travel time reliability measures for the National Highway System, CMAQ measures for on-road mobile source emissions, as well as freight movement on the interstate. I'm going to try to keep this at a fairly high level. Thank you. Try to keep this at a fairly high level, but if there are questions, please let me know. So the first measure we'll go through are the PM2 measures for pavement. The state and the MPO are required to set interstate pavement conditions for a 4-year target for both good and poor condition pavements, and we're also required to set non-interstate pavement condition targets, 2- and 4-year targets for the non-interstate national highway system. This chart provides the metrics that are utilized for determination of good and poor pavement conditions. There's a series of metrics over here on the left-hand side of this chart. A good pavement has to meet all of the metrics for the appropriate pavement type. A poor pavement is considered poor if 2 of the metrics are poor, and the remaining pavements would then be a fair condition. Data that's utilized for the pavement condition performance measure comes out of the Highway Performance Monitoring System, which is a long-standing annual reporting system. We were only able to use fiscal year 2017 data. The data that is required by the rule is a new format for fiscal year 2017. As you can see on this chart up here, we have almost 57% of our pavements are in good condition on the interstate, with only about 2 miles on the interstate in poor condition. On the non-interstate NHS, we're almost at 51% good condition, 0.4% poor condition. And as I mentioned, we only have 1 year of data in this format, so we don't really have a historic trend line. So the agency made a decision to try to set a conservative target that was both reasonable and achievable using past indicators, and then we plan to review this proposed target or this target at our mid-performance report period. So to that end, here's the slide summarizing our targets for both good and poor pavement condition on the interstate and non-interstate national highway system. On the interstate, we set a 4-year target of good being 54%, a maximum of 3% in poor condition. On the non-interstate national highway system, we set 2 and 4 year targets, good at 44% and poor at 6%. The next target we'll go through is bridge, and here's the bridge metrics that are utilized to evaluate bridge condition. The data comes from the National Bridge Inventory Database, which establishes ratings for deck, superstructure, and substructure. Each of those 3 bridge elements is rated from a 0 to 9, and the lowest overall rating for that, any of those components establishes the overall bridge rating. As you can see here, if all the components are greater than 6, it's considered a good bridge. Less than 5 would be a poor bridge, and anything in between then is fair. The measures that we have to establish are for National Highway System bridges classified by deck area for good condition and poor condition. I'll also point out that there's a federal requirement that no more than 10% of our bridge deck area can be classified as poor. And again, we have to provide or set 2 and 4 year targets. This chart provides bridge condition over time since 1998. As shown by the blue line here, we've seen a decrease in our bridges in good condition, a commensurate increase in bridges in fair condition, and would point out that our bridges considered in poor condition are pretty steady and less than the 10% statutory threshold. So the targets that MDT set for 2-year and 4-year bridge condition on the National Highway System, a minimum of 12% in good condition and a maximum of 9% in poor condition by bridge deck area. Moving over to PM3, there's 4 sets of targets that we'll go through here. There's travel time reliability as measured in the percent of person miles that are considered reliable on both the interstate and non-interstate system, a freight reliability index on the interstate system, and on-road mobile source emissions measures required for the CMAQ program. The 3 travel time reliability metrics have a very specific data set required by the final rule. That data set's called the National Performance Management Research Data Set. It's derived from vehicle or probe data obtained from GPS, navigation units, cell phones. It covers the entire NHS system. It's recorded in 5-minute intervals continuously throughout the year, so it's an extremely large data set. In order to evaluate it, MDT purchased analytical tools through a pooled fund study that's being led by AASHTO. So the charts you're going to see in the next couple slides are from that analytical tool. We'll start with the percent of person miles that are considered reliable on the interstate system. Again, the rule requires a 2-year and 4-year target. This data is provided by the MPM RDS analytical tools that MDT purchased. And I would mention when we talk about reliability that it's not necessarily a measure of congestion. It really is a measure of consistency or dependability on a road segment on how long it takes from point A to point B. So as you can see here on the interstate system, the tool is telling us that we've been extremely reliable on a statewide basis from a high of 99.9 in 2012 down to a low of 99.8 in 2017. These bars down here tell us that the data is pretty consistent. We've had extremely high reliabilities since 2012. So to that end, the agency set a statewide reliability target of 98% on the interstate system. Again, that's fairly conservative, but we consider it to be reasonable and achievable. As part of our process, we evaluated our interstate reliability measures against neighboring states. That's summarized in this particular table up here. And again, this is Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And as you can see, our reliabilities on the interstate are fairly consistent with our neighbors, all very high. The next measure that we have to set is a 4-year target for person miles that are considered reliable on the non-interstate national highway system. This data is a little bit more concerning. As we go back to 2012, we see some significant variability in the data set. What we've been told by the vendor and the folks that are doing the analytics for the pooled fund study is that we expect the data to, into the future, to look more like this data that started in 2017, that there were some data and analytic enhancements that happened in 2017. Having said that, again, this historic data causes us concern, so we set or tried to set a reliability target that was pretty conservative given this historic data at 80%. As with the other travel time measure, we compared it to our surrounding states. And what you can see here is that in 2012 to 2017, all of our neighboring states have had a pretty significant increase in reliability on their non-interstate national highway system, mainly as a result of data enhancements. The next measure is a reliability index for truck travel time or freight. This is simply an index number. There are no person miles traveled. This is just, again, just an index. Data and analysis, again, comes from the tool. A higher index value indicates lower reliability, so a lower value is better. As you can see, we had a high of 1.29 in 2012, down to a low of 1.21 in 2016. Historic data is fairly consistent, and again, we set a fairly conservative 2- and 4-year target at 1.3. As with the other measures, we compared it to surrounding states, and as you can see here, we're fairly consistent with our neighboring states, although our reliabilities are slightly higher in Montana. Slightly higher index. So the last measure then is the on-road mobile source emissions measure required by the CMAQ program. Before I jump into that, I just want to remind everybody how the CMAQ program is structured in Montana. Montana is considered a minimum apportionment state, meaning that Missoula, as you know, is the only area in the state that receives mandatory CMAQ funding. The remainder of the CMAQ apportionment for Montana is considered flexible, and those flexible funds are eligible for any project that is both CMAQ and CBEC eligible project, or a project that would be eligible for the Surface Transportation Program, so a very flexible funding set. Targets for this particular measure have to be established for areas designated as non-attainment or maintenance for ozone, carbon monoxide, or particulate matter. And for Montana at a statewide level, we were required to set a target for CO, PM10, and PM2.5. Again, the rule is prescriptive as to what data set and system is required to evaluate this measure. In this particular case, the CMAQ public access system is required for evaluation of the measures. This is the system that MDT uses to report emissions benefits on the CMAQ program. And per FHWA guidance, only quantitative emissions benefits, meaning a number for emissions benefits expressed in kilograms per day reduction, are required for the mandatory projects. So only the projects that Missoula does are required to be reported in a number format. All the CMAQ projects that MDT does with our flexible funding are qualitative emissions benefits, meaning there's no number associated with them. So to that end, because MDT doesn't really have projects that per FHWA guidance are reported with a number, we set at a statewide level a target for those three criteria pollutants at something greater than 0 kilograms per day for both a 2-year and a 4-year target. At a statewide level, we know that Missoula is going to continue to get CMAQ funding that you guys are going to continue to do projects that result in emissions benefits, and that those will be reported up to us for submission to FHWA. So again, this is the CMAQ funds that MDT has authority over will not be reported for emissions benefits, but Missoula's will. This slide summarizes everything I just went through. That's a pretty high-level and quick presentation as to the process that we went through. MDT established our targets on April 3rd, so now the MPO has 180 days from April 3rd to either set your own targets or to adopt the state targets and then plan and program projects that would contribute to those targets. So with that, that's all I've got. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions?
I guess my question is just, so you talked a lot, the states are mostly interstate, or are they all state highways that you're required to do, these numbers?
No, so as you can see up here, the PM2 targets for pavement are on interstate pavement, non-interstate pavement, non-interstate national highway system pavement, and then bridge targets were for the national highway system, both interstate and non-interstate national highway system. Travel time reliability measures are for the interstate and non-interstate national highway system, and then truck travel time is only on the interstate. So it really is focused on the national highway system.
So I guess my question is then, we're adopting for the MPO, and of course we want our bridges and roads and stuff to be good, but do we have to do the time and the freight reliability and all those things too?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Dave?
So maybe recap for me again the CMAQ target measures, why it's just greater than 0 as opposed to some affirmative positive number higher than that.
Sure. Well, so again, I'll back up to this, how the CMAQ funding is divvied up in Montana. And again, we're a minimum apportionment state. Missoula is the only area in the state that gets mandatory CMAQ funding. The rest is flexible, that comes that the state of Montana, MDT, operates under. And per FHWA guidance, there's only a number reported for the mandatory projects or the Missoula projects. All the flexible funding projects are reported to FHWA as a qualitative benefit, that there's no number associated with them. While we recognize that there is a benefit, there's no actual value that FHWA has us put in the system. So while we know that there's a benefit to the projects that we do at a statewide level, we don't know a number for it. So that's why we picked something greater than 0.
Something. So when we were originally talking about that particular performance measure and target with MDT, we had a conversation about, well, should we use Missoula's numbers as the numbers for the whole state? And so it would be looking at the emissions reductions that we get from Missoula's CMAQ projects, which include Missoula in Motion, Bike Ped, Mountain Line, Mr. TMA, street sweepers, and we submit those numbers every year to the state. But there was some feeling from us, as well as the other MPOs, that we didn't want to have to carry that requirement for the whole state. Like, for example, Great Falls was like, well, we have no control over what Missoula does, so why would we use Missoula's numbers as the statewide target? So, long story short, we felt like, even though it seems kind of silly to say greater than 0 as an appropriate target, because we're the only ones that are required to do actual CMAQ projects and report numbers out of the whole state, we didn't really want to be the poster child, if you will, for the state, and they didn't want us to be that either, and neither did any of the other MPOs. Does that make sense? It's a little awkward. Yeah.
Thanks. So I think it's important to note, this is more of a comment, that, you know, it's incredibly important to have transportation assets that are in a state of good repair. Going back to that bridge deck condition, I mean, it's an unfunded mandate in a way where there's performance measures for condition. There is no funding for rehabilitation beyond the current level, which is insufficient. So I think that's just an important thing to continually get into the record. And I'll leave it at that. Any other questions or comments on this? Okay. I'd entertain a motion to approve or to direct staff to do otherwise.
I would move that we approve the MOA for cooperative performance-based planning, safety performance measures, and targets.
Thanks. The motion is in order. Is there a second? Okay. Any further committee discussion? Any public comment on this? Okay, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion will pass. Thank you, Craig, for the presentation on that. So now let's move on to item 5.2, which is an update to the MPO designation and the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Process Memorandum of Agreement.
So in your packet, you'll see what was a draft agreement that was brought forward to TTAC a couple weeks ago. We've pulled it from being an action item today, instead to just have a discussion about the update to the agreement. And the agreement is it's kind of the overarching agreement that was created when the MPO was created back in 1982. It's between the state, the city, the county, Mountain Line. And it's essentially something that says that we all agree as agencies to work together under the MPO to produce the transportation planning process that's required by us by the federal legislation. And so there was an original designation by the governor back prior to 1982, and the governor designated the MPO as the Missoula County Planning Office at that time. And then shortly thereafter, the original MPO agreement was created, and it said that the MPO consisted of the Missoula County Planning Board, which was at that time, the only kind of joint agency, multi-jurisdictional governing body in place at that time. Long story short, we've, since that time, 35 years ago or more, there's been multiple iterations of the Missoula County Planning Office. There's been, combined planning efforts between the city and the county, and then separations, and then combinations again, and then more separations, and different names of the various planning offices. And so to try to bring our agreement up to where we are now and not have this kind of flow chart, if you will, of all of the various iterations, we are asking MDT to talk to the governor about having the MPO redesignated so that it simply says that the MPO is the TPCC. And that would essentially say that, and this is how it's functioned essentially since the beginning, is that the TPCC is the governing body for the MPO, and that the members of the TPCC are the decision makers. The MPO is not itself the staff of the MPO, and it doesn't matter where those staff have their offices, if they're embedded in the city or the county or out in an office on their own. It would establish that the TPCC is essentially in charge and is the MPO. So I think that's the right thing to do. MDT staff is working on doing that. I don't think it's a difficult thing to do. It just might take a little bit more time. And so I would expect an updated agreement to come back to you guys in the semi-near future.
Thanks, Dave.
I think you just answered the question. So the document that we have here is not the updated document.
No.
Because that's what tripped me up when I saw that Development Services was still
Right.
designated here as the MPO.
I just wanted to show you guys what we had originally brought to TTAC, and then the conversation kind of came up about the confusion, pretty much stemming back to the time of designation where, there was a discrepancy in the name of who the MPO was versus the actual name of the office. And I think it's 35 plus years later, I think it just makes sense to try to just put it, redesignate it as it stands now, and to what I foresee it being for forever, really. And so this overarching agreement, it's a very simple document. It's only about 5 or 6 pages, and it just kind of outlines that we're required to produce the transportation planning process. We're required to have a TPCC. The TPCC will be the MPO, and it just is very basic. We then have our bylaws, which is where if membership changed, that's where you would do that. And if there were changes to the process, then that's where those changes would have to be, and you would never necessarily need to have a redesignation or even update this agreement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So process-wise, the ask has been made of MDT. They will speak with the governor, and the governor will send us a letter or something.
Correct. Right, and when MDT does send that letter to the governor asking for redesignation, it'll be CC'd to each of the entities that are part of it, so including Mountain Line. Ultimately, that agreement will come forward to TTAC, it'll come forward to TPCC, assuming that it's approved, then it will go to the agencies to have signed by, board chairs and a county attorney, city attorney, Mountain Line attorney, et cetera.
Okay, thanks. Any additional questions? Okay. Is this consistent with how Great Falls and Billings have their agreements structured?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I can ask. We did ask MDT if they, do you remember what they said about that? I don't. I think everybody's a little bit different, but what I had asked them is if they had any idea of if similarly constructed MPOs in other states have their agreements having the governing board be the designated MPO, and they said that they had not done that research yet, and they felt like they didn't need to, but if you guys would like us to get more information about that, we'd be happy to. The way I read the legislation is that it says that the policy board is the MPO, and it seems pretty clear to me, but.
Dave?
Yeah, I would agree. That seems the most logical entity to be the MPO. It strikes me, and has struck me, as a little odd that an agency of, or a department of one of the partner government entities is, or has been designated the MPO rather than this body here.
Right.
So I would agree.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd agree as well. And I think it's important to note that 4/7 of the body are directly elected members that are accountable to the voters. And another 2 are very important appointed positions. And of course, MBT needs to be there, although they're not they're a little further removed from elected leadership. There's obviously importance in having them here as well. Okay. Any additional discussion on this or public comment? Okay. Thank you for the update on this.
Thanks.
And I spoke with Dave about this earlier. I have a commitment and I need to leave and turn the chairship over to Dave for the pedestrian facilities plan. And so I guess that'll create an awkward non-quorum, but it's not an action item, so that should be fine. Before I go, I'll jump into in the closing comments portion. I know this is your last TPCC meeting, Jessica, and I want to thank you for your service and wish you all the best. It's been a real pleasure working with you, and I know you'll go on and do great things in other places, and we'll miss having you here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this. It's been great working with and for everyone, and I'm excited for Missoula's next chapter. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot. And
Aaron, the mic is yours.
All right, it's such a small audience, I don't know that we need it, but. All right. So it's been a couple of months at least since we've been here talking about the pedestrian facilities master plans. We thought it would be a good time to give an update, kind of let TPCC know where we're at, and maybe get a little bit of feedback as we head into the final phases of that planning process. So, overview of where we're at. We started almost a year ago with collecting some existing conditions, doing inventories, getting all of our data cleaned up and ready to help us evaluate the pedestrian facilities. We've spent the last several months working on establishing a way to prioritize funding and prioritizing where we would put pedestrian facilities, knowing that we don't have enough resources to do all of it in the way that we would want in the near future. And now we're kind of moving beyond that, hoping to wrap some of that up and move into the implementation. So kind of the hard questions of where is the funding coming from? Are there other strategies we can take to help get more out of the resources that we have? And then, again, we're still hoping to have the plan finalized and adopted in July and August. So we're more or less on track with what we set out to accomplish with this plan. Let's give you a quick reminder of, we've presented some of this, but we've made some changes in terms of the prioritization of where sidewalks will go. We took an approach of looking at kind of a spectrum of options, one end being prioritizing social equity and kind of the demographic data, things like obesity and income, and other household kinds of information. The other end of that spectrum was looking at the built environment, so things that are attractors or generators, things that you would walk to, like bus stops or parks or schools or particular residential and employment densities. And then we came up with some options that were combinations of each of those, so somewhere in the middle along that spectrum. So again, kind of a reminder that the data that we used on the social equity side, most of this is demographic data or things that are coming from the census or similar data sources. So it looks, very neighborhood-like. Most of that data is at the census block group or tract level. So it's a generalization of that area, not necessarily discrete locations for most of that. Particularly related to income, age of the people living in those areas, things like disability, health statistics. Tends to be a little bit more regional than site-specific. The data sets that we used for that were obesity, aging adults, people with a disability, zero vehicle households, and low to moderate income. And these are just kind of a snapshot of what those data sets look like when we're looking at places with high concentrations of any of those particular populations. At the other end, the attractors in the built environment, they're much more discrete locations, so we're looking at specific bus stops. That's this example, our high ridership bus stops. We applied a quarter-mile buffer to all of these locations. That is sort of the typical easy walking distance for most people. When you talk about how accessible transit is, it's typically, how many people live within a quarter mile. Same with parks, schools, things like that. That's just the easy walking distance. So thinking about prioritizing within that distance of all of those data sets. So we looked at a number of different locations. So examples are parks, schools, grocery stores, services for aging adults, emergency services, things like the Poverello, or other emergency treatment facilities, places where people might be highly dependent on pedestrian facilities. And we also looked at residential and employment density. So we set some benchmarks of what we consider to be moderate or higher residential density, and then did the same for employment. And we based that on some other studies. We looked at some of the work that Mountain Line had done on their plan in terms of what densities would be required to support transit, and thinking that would be a good way to sort of set those levels of what's considered high or moderate densities. Then we took all those data sets. If you'll remember, we presented this a couple of months ago. We didn't assign value judgment to any of those in the initial scoring process. We just applied the same proportional points to each of those. So within the social equity data, we had those 5 data sets. We scored them all proportionally with the same potential number of points for being in an area of high obesity or high percentage of zero-car households, et cetera. And then for the destinations, if a particular block was within a quarter mile of any of those destinations, it got essentially 5 points for that. So looking at a total score of 100 being if you were within a quarter mile of all of these things, that block would score 100 points. And same for the social equity data. And then for the in-between data sets, we just took the percentage score from each of those and then combined them. So again, still had a maximum score of 100. So this allowed us to look at all of these things, more or less equally and compare how that prioritization would go. So we had a public meeting after we did all of that prioritization, or that initial step of setting up the methodology. We did some mapping exercises, we did presentations, got some feedback, asked some questions about how or why people are walking and where. We reviewed those prioritization options and then asked folks there to select which one they thought was the most appropriate. So we did a tabletop mapping exercise where we took wiki sticks, which are little wax pieces of string that you can stick onto the maps. People could cut them up, move them around, and it represented essentially 5 miles of sidewalk. So if you had to prioritize that limited amount, where would you put it to get a sense of where the most important locations for pedestrian facilities? Again, this would allow us to look at different prioritization methods to see if where people think the most appropriate place or the most need is for a sidewalk matches with that prioritization, and get people thinking about how would you prioritize sidewalks before we ask them to review what we had prepared. So you can kind of see the thickness of these lines represents more people prioritizing that particular piece of roadway for sidewalks. So the number of tables that said that we should prioritize sidewalks there. Did you?
Is that Mullen?
This is River Road. Yeah, so here's Reserve, River Road, Russell, Higgins. Yeah.
What are the other fat ones that go this way?
So this is Curtis and this is Eaton.
So this is a compilation of every place that folks identified for
Yes.
sidewalks. So there's, if it's not identified here, folks did not
Yeah.
put their sticky
Yep, exactly.
line on there. Okay.
Yeah.
Just, it's also.
Who showed up?
Who showed up? Yeah, yeah.
So there were 3 people who did. No.
We had about 30 people there.
Okay.
So yeah.
And then what's the other little fat one now? That one,
Oh, up here. So this
coming down here.
Oh, this is California.
California.
Yeah, yeah. And then you've got Rattlesnake Drive and Greeno Duncan Drive here. I think this is 23rd. I believe, or no, this is 23rd. This might be Garrett. Yeah, right. Yeah. So again, this is this isn't necessarily representative of the whole city, but it was interesting to see for the folks who were there, where they would prioritize. And some of that is based on, we know we had a number of folks from River Road there, but it still tells us within that neighborhood, how are people thinking about prioritizing sidewalks. So then we did some live polling during that meeting to ask a few questions about why people walk, so what the purpose of their trip is, or their typical trip for walking. little less than half of the attendees said they typically walk to commute or to work or school. The next highest was personal errands, so things like going to the grocery store or other particular, non-work trips. And then the last two are exercise and health and recreation. And I will point out, again, we asked a very similar question on our household travel survey during the long-range plan update, and that was statistically valid for the whole MPO region. And in that, the highest rated responses were exercise, health, and recreation. So a little bit of difference in who attended this meeting versus, maybe reasons people are walking in the rest of the urbanized area. So just a little context of that. Yeah, well, this was just the folks that were at that meeting. So it's that was a household survey. So that was run by the university, and they did a random sample, and so we could say more about how that applied to everyone in the rest of the city. So we also asked about how folks would prioritize different destinations. So looking at what we included in our prioritization, we asked attendees how they would prioritize it, again, giving them the option of allocating those 100 points. And what we found is there were kind of a top 5, and then the rest of them, and the top 5 were grocery stores, transit stops, parks, schools, and commuter paths. And it was interesting, this matched pretty closely with our steering committee and what those folks thought were kind of the higher order or more important destinations versus ones that, maybe we wouldn't want to or not that we wouldn't want to prioritize them, but, less important in that prioritization. We also asked about prioritizing different kinds of demographic data. Not as much of a clear difference. But income was clearly a high priority for folks. Maybe obesity not as much. That was interesting. So we took all of that. We took comments from TTAC and TPCC when we presented some of this several months ago, and from our steering committee. And we revised the scoring a little bit and the kinds of things that were in here. Primarily on the built environment. So we took those highest rated 5 destinations and increased the weight that we gave to those and decreased the weight of those other destinations. So thinking about prioritizing the schools, transit, grocery stores, parks, and commuter paths a little higher. We kept the socioeconomic or that social equity data evenly distributed. We just didn't hear enough from folks that we should prioritize one over the other. And then we kind of refined some of the data. We looked at whether we should just do elementary schools or all schools, again, K through 12. And we decided on keeping all of the schools in there because, high school kids will want to walk just as much as an elementary student, and it's important to keep that continuity throughout the schools. We also added some additional senior services destinations, so things like, I think before we just had nursing homes, and we added in things like aging services, some of the assisted living facilities, where you might have more mobile older adults. Some of the feedback we got was those nursing homes, they're often not, out. Yeah, some of them, I mean, you can't get out, or especially the memory care places where, they're really a much more controlled environment. So we made some of those changes and then went back through the prioritization. So that led us to kind of our second round of prioritizing. The first one up here is just the social data. So this is the social equity piece only. And you can see some of the higher priority areas are the downtown, north side, west side, and parts of Franklin to the Fort and around Community Hospital. And then, again, some of the areas along the river East Broadway. For the built environment only, it's much more dispersed in how those priority scores look in terms of the geographic city. Part of that is just based on the data sets. It's less aggregated, generalized areas, so you get more specific, but still seeing a lot of high priority in the downtown, north side, west side, some of the Franklin to the Fort. Just a little bit different areas in some of those neighborhoods. and then you see more higher priority down at the south end of town. And then the mixed options are just combinations of those. So looking at a 50-50 split, you can see how the different data sets are influencing that, where you still have the downtown, north side, west side, Franklin to the Fort, but maybe some additional higher priority closer to third. Oops. And then 3070 built environment, again, you can, there's more of an emphasis on those specific destinations, less on the social economic data. And then the socioeconomic and built environment with an emphasis on that social equity. You can start to see some areas where you'd have a higher priority within those neighborhoods that have the high income and health disparities. Yeah, so we've kind of tried to tackle this issue of so we set just some standard classes of point breaks for what is lowest to highest priority. Depending on where you set those breaks can change how these maps look. So some of these blocks in here might be, 1 point on the low side of high priority. So, you change those classes, or where you're drawing that line of what's high priority or not, can change how these maps look a little bit. So we kind of experimented with that a little bit, looking at, 10 classes, so you get like more of like a heat map look versus, 3 classes, a high, moderate, low, and then looking at where you draw that break. And so ultimately these might look a little bit different. When we have the final plan, it's not going to change the priority, but what is showing up here as the highest priority, those areas might get a little bit bigger when we get those breaks set appropriately. Any questions about that? And that's a little bit of a kind of sciencey math question, but just so you're aware, these areas can change a little bit based on how you draw where you draw the line on what's high priority or not. So we asked folks, as I mentioned, to vote on which option they preferred. At the public meeting, the mixed method, but with an emphasis on social equity, was the most preferred, and that was also what our steering committee said that was their preferred option. And it's also what TTAC voted to recommend that TPCC, that we move ahead with that particular option for prioritizing sidewalks. I also want to put out, since we have 2 of our 3 TPCC members left here represent the county, and we've had some conversations about how this prioritization might apply outside of city limits. So there's not necessarily a dedicated funding source for building sidewalks. We may not want to be building sidewalks outside the city, and it just, this map looks like the core is where all the higher priority areas are. And so we wanted to address areas outside of the county a little bit differently, but still use some of the same criteria of, what are the social equity issues that you can address with pedestrian facilities, and what are the destinations. But instead of having, focusing specifically on this low to high priority, we might take an approach where we're looking at an approach where we identify specific areas that might have different characteristics that will tell us something about the kind of facility and how to do that. So kind of the 2 examples here are Target Range Orchard Homes, which is more of a rural feel. It's not completely rural, but it lends itself maybe more to doing shared use paths. We see a lot of shared use paths out there. And folks may not want curb, gutter, and sidewalk on every street out in Target Range Orchard Homes. The difference in East Missoula, or it might be a little different there, it's more of a city grid network. It feels more like you're in a city. It's more compact, and there may be more interest out there for actually installing sidewalks. That's probably not a universal opinion there, but feels more like a city that has higher densities and might support curb, gutter, sidewalk. So that's kind of how we're thinking we'll approach areas outside the city limits, that you still have these criteria you can use of how are you linking people to schools and parks, but it's going to look different out in Target Range Orchard Homes than it might in Franklin of the Fort neighborhood, for instance. And so this prioritization may not apply in the same way. And depending on the funding source, if you're going after grants, those are so grant criteria specific that you can't necessarily just look at your highest priority areas. It's going to depend on that funding source. So using a little bit more context outside of city limits. So the other question we were trying to get at that we've done since the last time we were at TPCC was looking about safety and accessibility. And how do we evaluate that in a similar kind of systematic way where we're looking at what are the risks and where is the greatest need. So we came up with some criteria again, looking at what are the risk factors for pedestrians, and those are primarily speed, volume, and the number of lanes. And then the things that can mitigate that risk are crossing improvements such as signals, roundabouts, curb extensions, crosswalks, traffic circles, median refuges, and other kinds of things like rapid flashing beacons would fall somewhere in this signals, roundabouts level of improvement. So then we took those, we created kind of a really basic formula of adding up how much risk there is at a particular intersection. So as speed goes up on a particular roadway, the amount of risk goes up, same with volumes and lanes. And we took these breaks from, there's a lot of research out there on what the most appropriate improvement is, and they typically all break down volumes and lanes and speeds in a similar way. And then we created some improvement points based on thinking if you have a signal, that would be about the appropriate treatment for, maybe a little bit lower speeds, higher volumes, lanes, that, if you get a combination of a couple of these things like a signal, curb extensions, and a median refuge, that would be sufficient for, your highest risk intersection. So trying to get the scoring so that if you had your highest risk intersection and all of those improvements, you'd essentially have a score of 0, that is a appropriately treated intersection. So then we did that. We evaluated all the intersections around Missoula. In this map, the size of the circle is the intersection score. So the higher the score, the more risk there is. So kind of the perfect example are some of these unsignalized, unimproved intersections along Reserve. You have high speeds, you have a lot of lanes, and you have really high volume. So it sort of shows you where you have the highest unmitigated risk, if you will, to pedestrians, or the lack of connectivity across those facilities. So Brooks obviously stands out, some parts of Orange Street, Reserve Street obviously, at the unsignalized intersections. And then you can see in the neighborhoods, most of these intersections don't need a whole lot of treatment because there's very few cars, there's very low speeds, and the crossing distance is pretty low. So that's kind of... There's just not a lot of signal, there's some improvements at these. Yeah, there's still some, it's not as bad as crossing Reserve Street or Brooks outside of a signal, but you can see some of the places where you do have signals, it's pretty easy to get across South Avenue. Whereas, even at a signalized intersection on Reserve Street, just because you have that signal there doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy or accessible for people to get across. That, if you imagine adding in some median refuges or some other treatments to this intersection, it could get better and easier for people to get across. So it kind of tells us where you have barriers to pedestrian travel. And then we can look at this, we can compare this with where our crashes are, we can look at where we're prioritizing sidewalks, try to pair intersection improvements. It's typically a different funding source than sidewalk construction, but as we're doing projects on some of these roadways or doing safety improvements, looking at where we're prioritizing sidewalks, where some of those other destinations are, and then doing intersection improvements that make those connections for folks. We're obviously not going to get to all of these intersections in the next 5 years or 10 years or probably even 20, but we can start strategically making those improvements that will give us good connectivity benefits. So that's kind of where we're at with prioritization. So we've established these prioritized areas. We're now looking at the funding piece. So how can we get more funding for new sidewalks, or crossing or safety improvements, sidewalk repair, ADA accessibility. There's still a question of how we fund those different things. And then at the end of the day, you still have to select a project in those areas, and we have that same criteria. So within a high priority area, looking at schools, transit, parks, some of those high priority destinations first, and then kind of work your way through the rest of the facilities. And I have some cost info. I can go through this pretty quick, but we did some analysis of what it costs to do a linear foot of sidewalk. All of this is probably out of date now. Costs of construction are going up pretty quickly now, just because of the amount of development that's going on, and the limits on how many contractors are available. But it gives us a sense of what the scale of the issue is. And we can compare that with what our funding sources are. So we know in the city we have the subsidy and assessment is about $840,000 a year, or that's been about what the city is spending on sidewalk construction. Not including other big roadway reconstructions like Russell Street or developer constructed sidewalks, but just dedicated sidewalk funding. Redevelopment agency is spending about $600,000 a year. That fluctuates, depending on the year and what other projects are going on. And it's also limited to the urban renewal districts. So once those are done, that funding source is not that useful for building sidewalks. So looking at the need, just within the city, we left the county off of this because it's not as clear, as I mentioned, we're probably not going to build curb, gutter, and sidewalk in every street in the urbanized area in the county. It just probably is not the appropriate improvement, and it requires a little bit more context. But within the city, using that $70 about a linear foot for constructing sidewalk, our need would be about $84 million just to complete the network. So that's not including sidewalk repair or upgrading ADA ramps or doing the safety crossings or any of the other improvements that we need. So and this number is likely higher today than, a month ago when we put these numbers together. So costs are going to continue to go up on this, but that gives you a sense of we're spending about $840,000 a year dedicated to sidewalks, and we have a need of more than 80 million. So. Yeah, exactly. So, about 100 years at that rate. Probably less because sidewalks are being constructed in other ways. Russell Street is adding sidewalks. Developers are building sidewalks with projects. So there's other ways that it's getting done, but it's not at a rapid rate. So there's a ton of need. And then, that, repair. So thinking about, we don't know exactly what the cost is going to be, but we know from our assessment, general condition of our sidewalks. So 10 being a brand new sidewalk, 1 being essentially a failing, crumbling. You look at all of those sidewalks out there, this curve is just going to continue to get worse over that time as we're building new sidewalks. So you can't just ignore sidewalk repair as you're moving ahead. So our funding outlook is not particularly rosy. We need to make good decisions on how we're investing those funds. And then there's some other challenges. There's lack of staff resources to get these projects done, whether it's doing the engineering or managing them. The street and pavement condition plays a role, so you don't want to tie new curb and gutter into failing pavement. Also with ADA ramps and those kinds of improvements, if you've done 10 or 15 overlays on a street and the crown of that road or the cross slope doesn't meet ADA standards, you can put in the ramps, but you're still not making that necessarily ADA accessible. And then we have a lot of right-of-way constraints around the city, so where do you put sidewalks if you're trying to maintain vehicle travel lanes? Brooks is a perfect example where there's not great sidewalks there, if any, and the right-of-way is super narrow, so how do you build sidewalks on a street that doesn't have the right-of-way? And then we have the labor and contractor capacity. So there's a lot of building going on right now. It just makes it more expensive to do these kinds of projects. And then we have to look at other standards. So street lighting, safety, boulevard trees are really critical for having good pedestrian environment and those safety improvements as well. So there's a lot of challenges that we're now moving into the phase where we're going to hopefully start to address these. So I guess the big question we have from TPCC, which maybe we can't officially answer, but our plan is to move forward based on all of the recommendations we've received to date, move forward with that kind of split option of prioritizing with an emphasis on the social equity side, but still factoring in the destinations and the built environment. And then if there's any feedback on other either funding or implementation outcomes that we can look into further as we move into that part of the planning process, we definitely appreciate the input. So with that, we do have our website up that has all the information from our open houses and other info that we've put out. That's at the MissoulaMPO.com. On the participate page, we're working again on kind of fleshing out how we'll describe the county versus city in terms of prioritizing sidewalks. And then we're also working on an ADA transition plan. So we've been having conversations with folks just to find out what are the barriers to someone who's blind versus someone who's in a wheelchair, because those don't always, improvement for one may make it worse for another, or, you know, what are those barriers and how can we address them above and beyond just the basic ADA standards to make them useful and not just legally accessible. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. If there's any input on any of this moving forward, I definitely appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Commissioner Curtis?
Just clarify again for me, please, the 70-30. So if we said that we agreed with what the committee and what the public so far has recommended, the 70-30, 70% of the money or focus? Okay.
No, it's in that prioritization. So there's, you know, the data like obesity and income and vehicles per household. 70% of the priority score would come from that data.
Oh, so it's the weight.
Yeah, it's the weight of
Okay, weighted score.
of that particular.
To determine those map areas.
Yeah, the
where you
prior-
can start to prioritize facilities in those areas.
Yeah.
Got it.
Corey?
So how long does a sidewalk typically last?
That's a good
I
question.
can say that there's some stamps on the sidewalk in front of our house that date back 100 years, and they're in better shape than sidewalks within the last decade that are crumbling, so
Right.
sorry to cut that off.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's it. It kind of just depends on the sidewalk. I mean, they can last up to 100 years. I mean, there's certainly sidewalks out there that are 100 years old that, you know, are in better shape than sidewalks that are 10 or 20 or 30 years, so.
It's not like a blue, it's 20 years.
No, I mean, I would hope most of them are good for 50 years or more, but
There's no
Yeah.
tree roots seem to be one of the
Yeah.
challenges that we face here. I know engineering, public works standards have been increased as far as the PSI that's required now for concrete in the city. Same for curb, gutter, and I think that's to try to have things last longer and be stronger. So hopefully sidewalks that have been installed more recently will last longer, barring tree root issues. And they're employing mitigation techniques for that now as well, try to keep tree roots from becoming issues, but still allow us to plant trees in boulevards.
Yeah, and while the 70-30 split, I guess, strikes me initially as defensible, it would sure be nice to have a few more members of TPCC present, TPCC present to weigh in on that. So in terms of how we move forward, what's kind of your timeline? I can't remember that first slide you had up there.
yeah, so we'll work on the kind of implementation and funding side of things over the next month or two. And there will be some recommendations, I imagine, that come out of that. And so then we'll be coming back to TPCC at least once or twice more before we adopt this or have it drafted. So there will be more opportunity to weigh in on that. Or, you know, folks can get a hold of us, you know, if there are concerns with any of these ways that we're looking at some of this. We're trying to take, you know, a data-driven approach and not, you know, go based on anecdotal or, you know, how we think about different, you know, not prioritizing different neighborhoods for one reason or another, but look at where we can get the most benefit out of our investment. So, yeah.
Thanks. Is there any public comment on the pedestrian facilities master plan update? And I do mean public comment as in the singular today. Okay, well, seeing none, I just want to also second the sentiments that Jordan shared earlier. Thanks so much, Jessica, for all of the time and energy you've invested in transportation and our community here in Missoula, and certainly all of my best wishes as you move forward.
Thank you. I might come back someday. We love it here. I do have one announcement that
Okay.
I just wanted to make. So James Stevens was appointed by the City-County Health Board, and we got an email maybe a month ago or so about him being switched over to a different committee, and the Health Board appointed Debbie Johnston to the TPCC. There was some concern, though, because she is, I think, a vice president or president of Morrison Merrily, which is a firm that frequently is working on transportation projects, whether they be planning related or construction. And so we consulted with the city attorney because just wanted to make sure that there weren't any real or perceived conflicts. His advice to us was to ask that the health board appoint a different person. And the reason being that even though Ms. Johnson would have been a non-voting member, she's weighing in on decisions that are budgetary, and those decisions ultimately lead to projects. And so she would have had to recuse herself from almost all of the decisions that the TPCC would make, because when you guys approve TIP amendments, for example, down the line, and it might be several years, those decisions could end up being a project that her firm worked on. So to be safe, we asked them to appoint someone else. Has nothing to do with her person, as a person or anything, just we want to make sure that there weren't any real or perceived conflicts. So I think their next meeting is this week, and I'm thinking they'll probably appoint a different person at that point in time. And when that happens, hopefully we can meet with them prior to the next TPCC meeting, and they can get up to speed. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Any other business before the committee? Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Seeing none, will be adjourned.